It was just another Tuesday morning at Lincoln High School. The kind of morning where students dragged themselves through the hallways, still half asleep, clutching their coffee cups and energy drinks like lifelines. Room 204 was no different from any other classroom in the building. The walls were covered with faded posters about mathematical formulas and motivational quotes that had been there for probably a decade. Mr. Harrison walked into the classroom at exactly 8:15, just like he had done for the past 23 years. He was in his late 40s with graying hair and reading glasses that constantly slipped down his nose. The students knew him well. He wasn't the type of teacher who tried to be cool or made jokes to get attention. He was straightforward, fair, and actually cared about whether his students understood the material or not. The morning light was streaming through the tall windows, creating patterns on the worn-out linoleum floor. Dust particles danced in the sunbeams, and the old radiator in the corner made its usual clanking sounds. Everything felt routine, predictable, safe. Mr. Harrison placed his leather briefcase on the desk with a soft thud. He pulled out a stack of worksheets, the papers still warm from the copy machine. The students groaned collectively. Worksheets on a Tuesday morning were never a good sign. It usually meant they were in for some serious brain work. "All right, everyone, settle down," Mr. Harrison said in his calm, measured voice. "Today we're going to challenge ourselves a bit. I've put together some problems from different areas of mathematics. Some are straightforward, some will make you think." He started walking around the classroom, placing a worksheet face down on each desk. The students exchanged worried glances. Jenny, who sat near the window, whispered to her friend about how she hadn't studied over the weekend. Tom, the class athlete, was already looking stressed, mentally calculating how this would affect his grade. "You have the entire period," Mr. Harrison continued. "Work through what you can. Show your work. Remember, it's not just about getting the right answer. It's about understanding the process." When he said, "Flip them over and begin," there was a rustling sound as 30 students turned their papers simultaneously. The worksheet had 2 full pages of problems. Most of them were challenging but manageable. The kind of questions that required focus but were within reach for a decent calculus student. But there, almost hiding at the bottom of page 2, was something different. Problem number 15. Mr. Harrison had found it in an old graduate-level textbook he'd kept from his own university days. He remembered struggling with it as a young student, spending hours trying to wrap his head around it. The problem dealt with prime numbers and their distribution, asking students to prove a complex theorem that involved advanced mathematical concepts. Here's the thing, though. Mr. Harrison didn't actually expect anyone to solve it. He'd included it more as a conversation starter, something to show his students that mathematics was a living, breathing field with questions that challenged even the brightest minds. He thought maybe 1 or 2 curious students might ask him about it after class, and he could share some interesting stories about unsolved problems in mathematics. What he didn't know, what he couldn't have known, was that this particular problem had a fascinating history. When Mr. Harrison had first encountered it decades ago, it was considered nearly impossible, part of an unsolved conjecture that had stumped professional mathematicians. But things had changed. Just 2 years earlier, a proof had been published in a specialized academic journal, the kind that only serious mathematics researchers would ever read. The classroom fell into concentrated silence. Pencils scratched against paper. Some students worked quickly through the early problems, building confidence. Others sat staring at question 3 or 4, tapping their erasers against the desk in frustration. A few had already given up and were sneaking glances at their phones under the desk. Mr. Harrison walked slowly between the rows, observing his students. He could usually tell who was genuinely engaged and who was just going through the motions. He'd stop occasionally to offer a hint or point someone in the right direction, never giving away the answer but helping them find their own path to understanding. The wall clock ticked steadily. 20 minutes passed, then 30. Most students had made it through half the worksheet. A few of the stronger students were near the end of page 1. And then there was David, sitting in the 3rd row by the door. David wasn't the star student of the class. That title belonged to Michelle, who sat in the front row and always had her hand up first. David wasn't the student who struggled either. That would be Chris, who came to every tutoring session and still barely maintained a C average. David was somewhere comfortably in the middle, the kind of student who did solid B work consistently, never causing trouble, never drawing much attention to himself. He was a quiet kid, 17 years old, with dark hair that always looked a bit messy and a tendency to bite his lower lip when he was concentrating. He'd moved to America from Taiwan 5 years ago with his family. His parents ran a small restaurant downtown, working long hours 6 days a week. David often helped out in the evenings, taking orders and clearing tables. Mathematics had become his favorite subject, not because he was naturally gifted at it, but because it made sense to him in a way that other subjects didn't. English class was hard because idioms confused him, and he still sometimes missed cultural references. History was overwhelming with all its dates and names. But math was the same in every language. An equation in Taipei meant the same thing in Texas. While other students rushed through problems or gave up quickly, David had a different approach. He was methodical, careful, thorough. He would read each problem twice, then think about it before writing anything down. His work was always neat, organized, easy to follow. When he flipped to page 2 of the worksheet, his eyes scanned down the problems. 11, 12, 13, 14, and then 15. He paused, read it again. This problem was different from all the others. It felt bigger somehow, more important. The way it was worded, the complexity of what it was asking. Something about it captured his attention completely. David didn't know that this problem had a famous history. He didn't know that his teacher had included it as an impossible challenge. He looked at problem 15 and thought to himself, "This is interesting. I wonder if I can figure this out." The bell rang, signaling the end of the period. Students jumped up, some frantically scribbling last answers, others gratefully surrendering their half-finished worksheets. They filed out quickly, already thinking about lunch and their next classes. David gathered his things slowly. He looked down at his worksheet. He'd completed problems 1 through 14, but problem 15 sat there, untouched except for a few preliminary notes he'd jotted in the margin. Something about it wouldn't let go of his mind. He folded the worksheet carefully and slid it into his backpack. Mr. Harrison was erasing the board, already preparing for his next class. He didn't notice the thoughtful expression on David's face as the quiet boy walked out the door. Nobody in that classroom, least of all Mr. Harrison himself, could have guessed what would happen over the next few days. How that one problem, included almost as an afterthought, would change everything. How a seemingly ordinary Tuesday morning would become the beginning of something extraordinary. David Chen walked through the crowded hallway, his backpack slung over one shoulder, his mind still on that last problem. Students rushed past him, laughing, shouting to friends, slamming lockers. The noise and chaos of a typical high school between periods swirled around him, but he barely noticed. He wasn't the kind of student people talked about. There were no rumors about him, no dramatic stories, nothing that made him stand out. If you asked his classmates to describe him, they'd probably say he was nice, quiet, smart enough. But memorable? Not particularly. He existed in that comfortable middle zone where life was peaceful but unremarkable. His locker was on the 3rd floor, number 347, decorated with nothing except a small periodic table sticker his science teacher had given out at the beginning of the year. Unlike other lockers covered in photos, mirrors, and motivational quotes, David's was plain. He grabbed his lunch bag and headed to the cafeteria. The cafeteria was its usual chaotic self. The smell of pizza and French fries mixed with floor cleaner, and too many bodies in one space. David found his usual spot at a table near the back, where he sat with a rotating group of other quiet kids. Today it was just him and Kevin, a boy from his chemistry class who was really into computer programming. "How was Harrison's class?" Kevin asked between bites of his sandwich. "Good. He gave us this worksheet," David replied, pulling out his lunch. His mom had packed him rice with vegetables and chicken still warm in its container. Was it hard? Most of it was okay, but there was this one problem at the end. David paused, trying to figure out how to explain it. It was different. Like really different from everything else. Kevin nodded but didn't ask more. He was already looking at his phone, scrolling through some coding forum. That was fine with David. He didn't really want to talk about it anyway. He just wanted to think. The thing about David was that he hadn't always been good at math. When his family first moved to America, he'd actually struggled with it. Not because he didn't understand the concepts, but because the language barrier made word problems nearly impossible. He'd sit in class, understanding the mathematics perfectly well in his head, but unable to decode what the English sentences were asking him to do. His 6th grade teacher, Mrs. Patterson, had noticed. She'd stayed after school with him twice a week, helping him translate the problems into concepts he could visualize. Slowly, mathematics became his safe space. Numbers didn't judge his accent. Equations didn't care if he sometimes mixed up American idioms. In the world of mathematics, he could be completely himself. Over the years, he'd developed his own way of learning. While other students relied heavily on their textbooks and class notes, David supplemented everything with resources he found online. He'd discovered forums where mathematicians discussed problems, websites where professors posted free lectures, even academic papers that were publicly available. He wasn't trying to show off or get ahead. He just found it genuinely interesting. On weekends, when other teenagers were at parties or the mall, David often spent hours reading about mathematical concepts that wouldn't appear in his curriculum for years, if ever. His parents didn't fully understand this hobby, but they were supportive. They'd fled difficult circumstances in Taiwan to give their children better opportunities. And if their son wanted to spend his free time reading about mathematics, well, there were certainly worse things he could be doing. David had a small bedroom in their apartment above the restaurant. The walls were thin, and he could always hear the sounds of the kitchen below. The sizzle of the wok, his father shouting orders in Mandarin, the clatter of plates. His room was modest but organized. A twin bed, a desk his father had built from scrap wood, a bookshelf crammed with textbooks and library books, and an old laptop his older sister had given him when she upgraded. That evening, after the lunch rush ended and before the dinner crowd arrived, David sat at the desk in his room. He'd finished his other homework quickly, Spanish vocab and a short essay for English class. Now he pulled out the worksheet from Mr. Harrison's class. He looked at problem 15 again. It asked students to prove something about the distribution of prime numbers. Prime numbers, those mysterious integers divisible only by themselves and 1. They seemed random, scattered throughout the number line like seeds thrown by an invisible hand, yet mathematicians had discovered they followed certain patterns, certain rules. The problem was asking him to prove one of these rules using formal mathematical logic. It required understanding not just what prime numbers were, but how to construct a rigorous proof, how to build an argument that would be airtight, unquestionable, valid in the eyes of any mathematician anywhere in the world. David read through the problem several times, letting it sink in. Then he pulled out a fresh notebook. He didn't use the one from class that was for regular assignments. This was his personal notebook, where he worked through interesting problems just for himself. He started by writing down what he knew. Basic facts about prime numbers, theorems he'd learned, properties that seemed relevant. His handwriting was small and precise, filling the page with observations and questions. "David," his mother's voice called from downstairs in Mandarin. "Come help with the dinner prep." He sighed, put down his pencil, and headed downstairs. For the next 4 hours, he was part of the restaurant rhythm, taking orders, carrying dishes, clearing tables, occasionally helping in the kitchen. His mind, though, kept drifting back to that problem. During a slow moment around 8:30, he stood at the counter folding napkins and found himself thinking about prime numbers. There was something elegant about them, something pure. They were the building blocks of all other numbers, and yet they remained mysterious even after thousands of years of study. His older sister, Rachel, came in around 9. She was home from community college for the weekend, studying business administration so she could eventually help their parents expand the restaurant, or maybe open a second location. She was practical, grounded, everything David wasn't. "You okay?" she asked, noticing his distracted expression. "You've got that look again." "What look?" "The look you get when you're thinking about math stuff. Your eyes go kind of unfocused and you forget to blink." David smiled slightly. "There's this problem from class. I can't stop thinking about it." "Must be some problem," Rachel said, grabbing a spring roll from the kitchen. "You want to tell me about it?" "You wouldn't understand." "No offense, none taken. Math was never my thing. But seriously, don't stay up too late obsessing over homework. It's not worth ruining your sleep." But Rachel didn't understand. This wasn't just homework to David. This was a puzzle, a mystery, a challenge that called to something deep inside him. The kind of problem that made his brain light up with possibilities. That night, after the restaurant closed at 11 and his parents had finished cleaning, David finally returned to his room. He should have been tired, He'd been up since 6 that morning, had a full day of school, then worked a busy dinner shift. But he felt energized, alert, focused. He sat at his desk and opened his notebook again. He worked until 1 in the morning, trying different approaches, hitting dead ends, backtracking, trying again. Nothing seemed to work. The problem remained stubbornly unsolved. Finally, he forced himself to sleep. But even as he drifted off, his mind was still churning through possibilities, turning the problem over and over like a Rubik's Cube, searching for the pattern that would make everything fall into place. What David didn't know, what he couldn't possibly have known, was that he was standing at the edge of something much bigger than a homework assignment. Mr. Harrison had given him this problem thinking it was impossible, a teaching tool about the limits of knowledge. But David didn't see limits. He just saw an interesting challenge that nobody had told him was supposed to be beyond his reach. Sometimes not knowing something is impossible is the greatest advantage of all. Wednesday morning came too quickly. David's alarm buzzed at 6, dragging him out of a dream where numbers floated through space like stars. He rubbed his eyes, feeling the weight of only 5 hours of sleep, but his mind immediately jumped back to the problem. It was like an itch he couldn't scratch, always there in the background of his thoughts. At school, he moved through his morning classes on autopilot. Spanish vocabulary quiz? He wrote the answers without really thinking about them. English discussion about symbolism in a short story? He nodded along, contributed when called on, but his real attention was elsewhere. During lunch, instead of going to the cafeteria, David went to the library. It was quieter there, with only a handful of students scattered among the tables, most of them cramming for tests or catching up on sleep with their heads down on their folded arms. He found a computer in the corner and logged in. His fingers flew across the keyboard as he searched for information about prime number distribution, about proof techniques, about anything that might give him a new perspective on the problem. He'd learned years ago that sometimes when you're stuck on a mathematical problem, the answer comes from looking at it from a completely different angle. The thing was, David had actually seen something related to this problem before. About 6 months ago, he'd been browsing a mathematics forum where people discussed various unsolved problems and recent breakthroughs. Someone had mentioned something about prime number distribution being proved recently, but David had only skimmed that thread. It hadn't seemed relevant to anything he was studying at the time. Now, sitting in the library, he tried to remember the details of that forum discussion. Had it been about the same type of problem? He couldn't be sure. He searched through the forum's archives but couldn't find the specific thread he was thinking of. Maybe he'd imagined it. Maybe he was confusing it with something else. What David didn't realize was that the problem Mr. Harrison had given him had indeed been solved. 2 years earlier, a mathematician at a university in Germany had published a proof in a specialized journal called Advanced Theoretical Mathematics. It was the kind of journal that only serious researchers read, published quarterly, available mostly through expensive academic subscriptions. The proof had made a small splash in the mathematical community. A few dozen experts had read it, verified it, cited it in their own work. But it hadn't made mainstream news. There were no headlines about it. It was just one more piece in the vast puzzle of mathematical knowledge, important to specialists but invisible to the general public. Mr. Harrison, who mostly kept up with teaching materials and standard textbooks, had never heard about this proof. Why would he? He was a high school teacher, busy with classes and grading and dealing with the day-to-day realities of education. He didn't have time to read specialized journals or follow cutting-edge mathematical research. So when he'd included this problem on the worksheet, he'd genuinely believed it was one of those legendary impossible problems, the kind that mathematicians had struggled with for decades. He'd included it to inspire wonder, to show his students that mathematics was alive and full of mysteries. David, meanwhile, sat in the library staring at his laptop screen. He'd found several papers about prime numbers, but none of them directly addressed the specific question Mr. Harrison had posed. This didn't discourage him, though. If anything, it made him more determined. He had a thought. What if he approached this using techniques from different areas of mathematics? He'd read about mathematicians who'd solved major problems by combining methods from separate fields, seeing connections that others had missed. Maybe that was the key here. He pulled out his notebook and started sketching ideas. Geometry could represent numerical relationships visually. Algebra could express patterns with elegant equations. Number theory provided the fundamental rules about primes. What if he used all three somehow? The bell rang, signaling the end of lunch. David closed his notebook reluctantly and headed to physics class. But throughout the lesson about momentum and collisions, his mind kept wandering back to prime numbers. After school, he had a decision to make. Wednesday was one of his lighter days at the restaurant. His parents didn't really need him until 6. He had 3 hours of free time, a rare luxury in his busy schedule. He could hang out with friends. Kevin had mentioned something about going to the arcade. Or he could go home and keep working on this problem that had consumed his thoughts for 2 days now. The choice was obvious. David went straight home, climbed the stairs to his room, and sat down at his desk. He opened his notebook and looked at all the work he'd done so far. Pages and pages of attempts, dead ends, ideas that led nowhere. Most people would have given up by now. After all, this was just one problem on a worksheet. It probably wasn't even going to be graded seriously. Mr. Harrison likely just wanted them to try, to engage with challenging material, not to actually solve it. But David wasn't thinking about grades or what was expected. He was thinking about the beauty of the problem itself. There was something elegant hidden in these abstract concepts about prime numbers. He could feel it just out of reach, like a word on the tip of your tongue. He started working again, trying a new approach he'd thought of during physics class. He drew a diagram, trying to visualize the relationship between numbers. He wrote equations, manipulating them, looking for patterns. He referenced theorems he'd learned, trying to see how they might connect. Time disappeared. The sounds of the city outside his window faded. The muffled noises from the restaurant below became background static. There was only him, the notebook, and the problem. At 5:30, his phone buzzed. His mom texting him to come down and help with prep. He looked at his latest attempt. It was different from all the others. More promising somehow, but still not quite right. Something was missing. Some key insight he hadn't grasped yet. Reluctantly, he put down his pencil and went downstairs. The restaurant was already getting busy with the early dinner crowd. He slipped into his routine, taking orders, running food, clearing tables. But part of his brain was still working on the problem, turning it over, examining it from every angle. Around 7:30, during a brief lull, David stood at the counter and had a sudden thought. What if he was making this too complicated? What if the solution wasn't about using advanced techniques, but about seeing something simple that everyone else had overlooked? He grabbed a napkin and a pen from his apron. Right there at the counter, between taking orders, he sketched out a quick idea. His sister Rachel walked past and shook her head, smiling. "You're obsessed," she said. "Maybe," David admitted, not looking up from the napkin. "Is this even for a grade?" "I don't know. Probably not." "Then why are you killing yourself over it?" David paused, considering the question. Why was he doing this? It wasn't for grades, wasn't for college applications, wasn't to impress anyone. He looked up at his sister. "Because it's there," he said simply. "Because it's interesting. Because I want to know if I can figure it out." Rachel laughed. "You're a weird little brother. But I guess that's not the worst thing to be." She walked away to help a customer, and David looked back at his napkin. The idea he'd sketched wasn't complete, but it was something. A thread he could pull on. That night, after closing, after his parents had gone to bed exhausted from another long day, David sat at his desk again. He looked at the napkin he'd brought upstairs, at all his previous attempts, at the original problem statement, and then something clicked. It wasn't a complete solution, not yet. But it was a breakthrough, a moment of clarity where suddenly the fog lifted just a little. He saw a path forward, faint and uncertain, but there. His heart started beating faster. His hands actually trembled slightly as he picked up his pencil. He started writing, working faster now, the ideas flowing more freely. This approach was different. This felt right in a way nothing else had. He worked until almost 3 in the morning, making real progress for the first time. When he finally forced himself to sleep, he lay in bed staring at the ceiling, too excited to close his eyes. He didn't know that his approach was completely original. He didn't know that he was walking a path no one else had ever walked before. He just knew that he was close to something real, something true, something beautiful, and he couldn't wait for tomorrow to keep going. Thursday and Friday passed in a blur. David went through his classes like a ghost, present physically but mentally miles away. His teachers didn't notice anything unusual. He still participated when called on, still turned in his assignments, still appeared to be paying attention. But inside his mind was racing through mathematical concepts, testing theories, building and rebuilding his proof. In Mr. Harrison's class on Friday, when the teacher asked if anyone had questions about the worksheet, David almost raised his hand. He wanted to ask about problem 15, wanted to confirm he understood what was being asked, but something stopped him. Maybe it was shyness, or maybe some instinct told him to keep working on his own for now. Mr. Harrison collected the worksheets at the end of class. Most students had attempted maybe 10 or 11 problems. A few had tried all 15 with varying degrees of success. When he got to David's worksheet, he noticed the boy had completed problems 1 through 14 correctly, with clear, methodical work shown. Problem 15 had some notes scribbled in the margin, but no real attempt at a solution. "Good work, David," Mr. Harrison said, not expecting anything different. David was a solid student, consistent, but not someone who'd typically tackle something at this level. The teacher filed the worksheets in his bag to grade over the weekend and thought nothing more of it. But David was thinking about nothing else. That Friday evening, as the weekend began and other students made plans for parties and movies and hanging out, David asked his parents if he could skip his restaurant shift. This was unusual. David almost never asked for time off. He was reliable, responsible, always there when they needed him. His mother looked at him with concern. "Are you feeling sick?" "No, I just need to work on something for school." His father frowned. "What kind of homework is so important you can't help your family?" David struggled to explain. How could he make them understand? "It's a math problem. A really difficult one. I think I'm close to solving it, but I need time to focus." His parents exchanged glances. They'd sacrificed so much to come to America, worked brutal hours to keep the restaurant afloat, to give their children opportunities. Education was important to them, the whole reason they'd uprooted their lives. "Okay," his mother said finally. "This weekend you can focus on your studies, but next week you help like normal." "Thank you," David said, relief flooding through him. "Thank you so much." He ran upstairs to his room, feeling like he'd just been given the greatest gift. 2 whole days, 48 hours to work without interruption, without distraction. It felt like infinite time. David started Friday evening around 7. He had his notebook spread across his desk, the original problem statement in front of him, and a feeling of determination so strong it was almost physical. He'd thought about this problem every spare moment for the past 4 days. Now he could finally give it his complete attention. He began by reviewing everything he'd done so far, all his previous attempts, the dead ends, the ideas that had seemed promising but led nowhere. He could see now where he'd gone wrong in some cases, see the flaws in his earlier logic. The breakthrough he'd had Wednesday night was about approaching the problem geometrically. Most proofs about prime numbers used pure number theory, abstract and symbolic. But what if you could represent the relationships visually? What if there was a way to see the patterns rather than just calculate them? He started drawing diagrams. At first they were simple, just dots representing prime numbers on a number line. Then he started arranging them differently, looking for patterns in their spacing and their distribution. He filled page after page with sketches, each one a slightly different way of visualizing the same information. Around midnight, his sister Rachel knocked on his door. "David, you okay in there?" "Yeah, I'm good." She opened the door and peeked in. His desk was covered in papers, and he had that intense, focused look he got when he was deep into a problem. "You've been at this for 5 hours straight. You should sleep." "Soon," he said, not looking up. "I just want to try one more thing. That's what you said 2 hours ago." "I could hear you through the wall muttering to yourself." "Was I? Sorry." Rachel came into the room and sat on the edge of his bed. "Seriously, what's so special about this problem? Is it for a competition or something?" David finally looked up. "No, it's just from class. The teacher put it on a worksheet. I don't think he even expects anyone to solve it." "Then why are you killing yourself trying?" David thought about this. "Because I can't stop thinking about it. It's like there's an answer hidden just out of sight, and if I can just look at it the right way, I'll see it. Does that make sense?" "Not really," Rachel admitted. "But you're the math genius, not me. Just promise me you'll get some sleep eventually." "I promise." She left, shaking her head with a smile. David turned back to his work. But he was starting to feel the exhaustion now. His eyes were burning. The numbers on the page were starting to blur together. Maybe Rachel was right. Maybe he should sleep. He worked for another hour, making notes about ideas to try tomorrow, then finally collapsed into bed around 1:30. But his sleep was restless, filled with dreams of numbers and patterns and diagrams that almost made sense but not quite. Saturday morning, he woke up at 6 even though he'd planned to sleep late. His mind was already working on the problem before he was fully conscious. He got up, splashed water on his face, and went straight to his desk. All day Saturday, he barely left his room. His mother brought him food on a tray, which he ate absently, barely tasting it. He heard the restaurant getting busy downstairs, heard his parents' voices and the clatter of dishes, and felt a pang of guilt. But he couldn't stop now. He was so close. He tried combining his geometric approach with algebraic techniques. He wrote out equations that described the visual patterns he was seeing. He tested his logic, looking for flaws, trying to poke holes in his own reasoning. That was what a real proof required. Not just showing that something worked, but proving it couldn't possibly fail. Around 4 in the afternoon, he hit a wall. Nothing was working. He'd been so sure he was on the right track, but now everything seemed wrong again. He put his head down on his desk, feeling tears of frustration prick his eyes. Maybe this was beyond him. Maybe he'd been foolish to even try. He thought about giving up, about going downstairs and telling his parents he'd wasted the whole weekend on nothing. But something wouldn't let him. Not stubbornness exactly, but something deeper. A belief that the answer was there, that it existed, that it was possible to find it. He lifted his head and looked at his work with fresh eyes. What if the problem wasn't that his approach was wrong, but that he was applying it incorrectly? What if he needed to adjust one small thing? He grabbed a fresh sheet of paper and started again, making one small change to his method. And suddenly, like a key turning in a lock, something clicked. The approach that had seemed impossible a moment ago now flowed naturally. One step led to the next, which led to the next, each building on the previous one in a logical, inevitable progression. David's heart started pounding. His hands were shaking so much he could barely write legibly. This was it. This was actually working. He worked through Saturday evening and into the night, barely aware of time passing. Around midnight, Rachel came to check on him again. "David, seriously, you need to sleep." "I can't," he said, his voice hoarse from hours of not talking. "Rachel, I think I've actually got it. I think I solved it." She came over to look at his papers, even though the mathematics meant nothing to her. "Are you sure?" "I need to check it. Need to verify everything. But yes, I think so. Then verify it tomorrow. You look like you're about to collapse." He did feel exhausted, running on pure adrenaline and determination. "Okay," he agreed. "But first thing in the morning, I'm finishing this." Sunday morning, David woke up at 5. He couldn't sleep anymore anyway. His mind too active, too close to the end. He reviewed everything he'd done Saturday, checking each step carefully. There were a few small errors, places where his tired brain had skipped steps or made minor mistakes. He fixed them, tightening the proof, making sure every logical connection was sound. By noon, he had it. A complete proof, written out clearly across 15 pages of notebook paper. It was elegant, creative, using techniques he'd learned from different sources and combining them in a way that felt new. He read through it one more time, then again, looking for any flaw, any weakness. He couldn't find one. As far as he could tell, it was correct. He'd actually done it. David sat back in his chair, feeling drained and exhilarated at the same time. His room was a disaster. Papers everywhere, empty plates stacked on his desk. Clothes he'd worn for 2 days straight. He probably smelled terrible. His eyes felt like sandpaper, but he'd solved it. He'd taken an impossible problem and found an answer. He thought about Monday, about showing Mr. Harrison what he'd done. Would the teacher believe him? Would he understand it? David felt a flutter of nerves. What if he'd made some fundamental error he couldn't see? What if the whole thing was wrong? No, he thought. No, it was right. He'd checked it too many times. It was solid. That afternoon, he finally went downstairs. His parents were taking a rare break between lunch and dinner service, sitting in the back booth with cups of tea. Monday morning arrived with the kind of nervous energy that made David's stomach flip. He'd barely slept despite being exhausted. His mind kept running through the proof, checking it one more time, then again, looking for any flaw he might have missed. He got dressed carefully, choosing a clean shirt, making sure he looked presentable. He packed his notebooks into his backpack with almost reverent care. These 15 pages represented the most intense intellectual work he'd ever done. They felt precious, important, like they contained something that mattered. His mother noticed his unusual quietness at breakfast.
Big day today?
Maybe, David said. I'm going to show my teacher what I did. He'll be impressed, she said with confidence. You worked very hard. The walk to school felt longer than usual. David's backpack seemed heavier, even though it contained nothing more than normal. He kept thinking about how to approach Mr. Harrison, what to say, how to explain what he'd done. He arrived at school 20 minutes before first period, which was unusual for him. The hallways were still relatively empty. Just a few early arrivals at their lockers or sitting on the benches scrolling through their phones. David went straight to room 204. Mr. Harrison was already there, as he always was, sitting at his desk grading papers with a cup of coffee steaming beside him. He looked up when David walked in, surprised to see a student so early. David, good morning. You're here early? Yes, sir. I was hoping I could talk to you about the worksheet. The one from last week, Mr. Harrison smiled kindly. Of course. Was there a problem you didn't understand? I know some of those questions were quite challenging. David took a deep breath. This was it. Actually, it's about problem 15. The last one. I think I solved it. The teacher's expression didn't change much, just a slight raising of his eyebrows. He'd heard claims like this before from enthusiastic students who didn't quite understand the complexity of what they were attempting. That's wonderful that you gave it a try, David. That problem is quite advanced. Why don't you show me what you came up with? David pulled out his notebooks, carefully organized into the sequence of his proof. 15 pages of work, diagrams, equations, logical steps building one upon the other. He opened to the first page. Could I use the board? He asked. Mr. Harrison hesitated. First period would start in 15 minutes, but the boy seemed so earnest, so serious, and honestly the teacher was curious to see what approach David had taken. It would be a good teaching moment, probably, to gently show him where his logic had gone astray. Sure, Mr. Harrison said, standing up. Go ahead. David went to the board and picked up a marker. His hand trembled slightly. He'd never done anything like this before. Presenting mathematical work to someone who actually understood it deeply. What if he'd made some stupid mistake? What if Mr. Harrison immediately saw a flaw that destroyed the entire proof? But he started anyway, writing carefully, explaining his reasoning as he went. He began with the basic setup, stating what needed to be proven. Then he introduced his approach, the geometric interpretation that formed the foundation of everything else. Mr. Harrison watched, his expression still patient and encouraging. This was a creative approach, he had to admit. Not correct, certainly, but showing some interesting mathematical intuition. He was mentally preparing how to let David down gently, how to praise the attempt while explaining why it didn't quite work. But then David moved into the second phase of his proof, and something in Mr. Harrison's expression shifted. He leaned forward slightly, his eyes narrowing as he followed the logic on the board. This was more sophisticated than he'd expected. David continued, filling the board with equations and diagrams, his voice growing more confident as he progressed. He was in his element now, explaining something he understood deeply, something he'd wrestled with for days until it finally submitted to his understanding. He reached a critical transition point in the proof, where he combined his geometric visualization with an algebraic technique. Mr. Harrison stood up from his desk and walked closer to the board. His coffee sat forgotten, growing cold. Wait, the teacher said softly. Go back. Explain that step again. David did, walking through the logic more slowly. Mr. Harrison's face had gone pale. His hands were actually shaking slightly as he pulled his phone from his pocket. David, he said, his voice strange. Stop for a moment, just hold on. He typed frantically into his phone, searching for something. Other students were starting to filter into the classroom now, preparing for first period. They saw David at the board covered in complex mathematics and Mr. Harrison staring at his phone with an expression of shock. What's going on? Jenny whispered to Tom. No idea, Tom whispered back. Is Chen in trouble or something? Mr. Harrison found what he was searching for. He read through it quickly, his eyes darting between his phone screen and the board. He looked at David with an expression the boy couldn't quite read. Not anger, not disappointment. Something else, something that made David's heart beat faster. Where did you learn this approach? Mr. Harrison asked. I didn't learn it anywhere, David said honestly. I just kept trying different things until something worked. You came up with this on your own? Over the weekend? Yes, sir. I worked on it Thursday, Friday, and most of the weekend. The bell rang, signaling the start of first period. Students scrambled to their seats, sensing that something unusual was happening. Mr. Harrison seemed to barely notice them. "Class," he said, not taking his eyes off David. "Take out your textbooks and work on problems from Chapter 7. Quietly. I need a few minutes here." The students exchanged glances, but did as they were told. The room filled with the sound of pages turning and backpacks unzipping. Mr. Harrison walked right up to the board, studying every line David had written. "This problem," he said quietly, so only David could hear. "I included it thinking it was essentially impossible. It was part of an unsolved conjecture when I first encountered it decades ago." David's stomach dropped. "Did I misunderstand what you were asking?" No, Mr. Harrison said quickly. "You understood perfectly. The thing is, David, this problem was solved about 2 years ago. But your approach, what you've done here, it's completely different from the published proof." David felt confused. "So is it wrong?" "I don't think so," Mr. Harrison said, and his voice had a quality of wonder in it. "I think you've independently derived an original proof. A new proof. One that no one has published before." The room felt like it tilted slightly. David gripped the edge of the board to steady himself. "That's not possible. I'm just a high school student." "I can't have done something new in mathematics. Why not?" Mr. Harrison asked. "Mathematics doesn't care how old you are or what credentials you have. It only cares about logic and truth, and if your logic is sound, if your proof is valid, then you've accomplished something remarkable." He turned to the class, who were all pretending to work but clearly listening to every word. "Change of plans today. David is going to finish showing us his work. Everyone pay attention. You're witnessing something special." David felt his face flush. All eyes were on him now. But Mr. Harrison was nodding encouragingly, gesturing for him to continue. So David picked up the marker again, his hand steadier now, and kept going. He worked through the rest of the proof step by careful step. The class watched in silence, most of them not really understanding the mathematics but sensing the importance of what they were seeing. Mr. Harrison followed along, occasionally asking questions, nodding as David explained his reasoning. When David finally wrote QED at the end, the traditional notation meaning that which was to be demonstrated, the classroom was completely silent. Then Mr. Harrison started clapping. Slowly the other students joined in, not really knowing why but understanding that something significant had just happened. David turned from the board, marker still in hand, feeling dazed. Had that really just happened? Had his teacher just confirmed that he'd done something original, something new? "David," Mr. Harrison said, his voice thick with emotion, "I need you to do something for me. I need you to let me make copies of your proof, and I need you to come back after school. There's someone I want to show this to." "Who?" David asked. "Dr. Patricia Okoye. She's the head of our mathematics department. She has a PhD from Princeton. If anyone can properly evaluate what you've done here, it's her." The rest of the period passed in a blur. David sat at his desk, still feeling like he was in a dream. Other students kept glancing at him, whispering. By lunchtime, rumors had spread throughout the school. David Chen, the quiet kid who worked at his parents' restaurant, had done something incredible in math class. Nobody was quite sure what, but Mr. Harrison had looked like he'd seen a ghost. David found Kevin at lunch. His friend immediately bombarded him with questions. "Dude, what happened in Harrison's class? Everyone's talking about it." "I solved a problem," David said simply. "Must have been some problem. People are saying Harrison was freaking out." David smiled slightly. "Yeah, it was some problem." That afternoon felt endless. David couldn't focus in any of his classes. His mind kept returning to the morning, to Mr. Harrison's expression, to those words, "something remarkable." When the final bell rang, David went straight to room 204. Mr. Harrison was there with an older woman David recognized from seeing around school. The next few days felt surreal to David. He'd gone from being invisible to being the center of attention, at least within the mathematics department. Dr. Okoye had wasted no time reaching out to her colleague at State University, and by Wednesday afternoon, David found himself sitting in a conference room at the university. His notebooks spread out in front of 3 professors who looked at his work with intense concentration. Dr. Helen Fitzgerald was the lead professor, a woman in her early 40s with curly red hair pulled back in a messy bun. and reading glasses that she kept pushing up her nose. She specialized in number theory, the exact branch of mathematics David's proof dealt with. Next to her sat Dr. James Park, an elderly Korean professor who'd been teaching mathematics for 40 years, and Dr. Lisa Washington, a younger professor who focused on proof techniques and mathematical logic. David sat across from them, trying not to feel intimidated. The conference room was on the 3rd floor of the mathematics building, with large windows overlooking the campus. Students walked past outside, completely unaware that something significant was happening in this ordinary-looking room. "David," Dr. Fitzgerald began, looking up from the notebooks, "I've spent the last 2 days going through your work very carefully. I have to say, I'm fascinated. But I need to understand your thinking process. Can you walk us through how you arrived at this approach?" David cleared his throat nervously. "I guess it started with visualization. I kept trying to see the relationships between prime numbers, not just calculate them. I made a lot of diagrams." "Show us," Dr. Park said, sliding a whiteboard marker across the table. David stood and went to the whiteboard that covered one wall of the conference room. He started drawing, explaining how he'd represented prime numbers spatially, how he'd noticed patterns in their distribution when viewed geometrically. The professors watched intently, occasionally stopping him to ask questions. "This is elegant," Dr. Washington murmured. "It's intuitive in a way that the standard proof isn't." "That's what struck me," Dr. Fitzgerald agreed. She pulled up something on her laptop and turned the screen so David could see it. It showed a mathematical paper, dense with equations and formal notation. "This is the proof that was published 2 years ago. It's valid, rigorous, and quite impressive, but it's also extremely complex. It uses techniques from several advanced areas of mathematics that most people wouldn't encounter until graduate school." She gestured to David's notebooks. "Your proof, on the other hand, uses more elementary techniques but combines them in a way that's completely original." "Did you study the published proof at all?" "No, ma'am," David said honestly. "I didn't even know there was a published proof until Mr. Harrison told me." The 3 professors exchanged glances. Dr. Park leaned back in his chair, a slight smile on his face. "Independent discovery. That's rare, but it does happen. But to independently discover a new approach to the same problem? That's exceptional." Dr. Fitzgerald spent another hour going through the proof line by line, testing every logical connection, looking for any possible error. David answered her questions, sometimes needing to think carefully but always able to defend his reasoning. As the afternoon wore on, he began to feel more confident. These were real mathematicians, people who did this for a living, and they were taking him seriously. Finally, Dr. Fitzgerald closed the notebook and looked at her colleagues. "I can't find any flaws. The logic is sound. The proof is valid." "I agree," Dr. Washington said. "It's brilliant, actually. The way he bridges between geometric intuition and algebraic rigor. It's exactly the kind of thinking we try to teach our graduate students." Dr. Park nodded. "The question is, what do we do now?" Dr. Fitzgerald looked at David. "With your permission, we'd like to write this up formally. Present it to the broader mathematical community. This deserves recognition." David felt overwhelmed. "I'm just a high school student." "Can you even do that? Present work by a high school student?" "Mathematics doesn't care about credentials," Dr. Fitzgerald said, echoing what Mr. Harrison had told him. "It only cares about truth and logic. Some of the greatest mathematical discoveries have been made by people working outside traditional academic structures. You've done something original and valuable. That's what matters." Over the next week, Dr. Fitzgerald worked with David to formalize his proof. They met several times, sometimes at the university, once at Lincoln High School, once even at David's family restaurant, where Dr. Fitzgerald insisted on trying the dumplings and declared them excellent. She taught him how to write mathematics in the formal style required for academic publication. She showed him how to cite previous work, how to structure an argument for maximum clarity, how to anticipate and address potential criticisms. David absorbed it all like a sponge, fascinated by this glimpse into the world of professional mathematics. His parents were proud but slightly bewildered. His mother kept asking if this meant he'd won a prize if there was money involved. His father worried it might distract from his regular schoolwork. Rachel teased him about becoming famous, but also told her friends with obvious pride about her genius little brother. At school, David became something of a celebrity. Students who'd never spoken to him before suddenly wanted to be his friend. Teachers who'd barely noticed him now smiled and asked how his mathematics project was going. It was uncomfortable, honestly. He didn't want this attention. He just wanted to think about interesting problems. Mr. Harrison, though, became something more like a mentor. He started lending David books from his personal collection, recommending online lectures, suggesting problems to think about. Their relationship transformed from teacher-student to something more like colleagues who shared a passion for mathematics. 2 weeks after that first meeting at the university, Dr. Fitzgerald called David with news. "We've submitted your proof to the Journal of Theoretical Mathematics. It's a peer-reviewed publication, which means other experts will evaluate it. The process usually takes a few months. And if they accept it?" David asked. "Then you'll be a published mathematician at 17. But David, even if they don't accept it for some reason, what you've accomplished is still remarkable. You've proven to yourself what you're capable of. That's valuable regardless of publication." But 3 weeks later, Dr. Fitzgerald called again, her voice excited. "David, I just heard back from the journal. They're fast-tracking your paper. The reviewers are impressed. They want to publish it in their next issue." David had to sit down. His legs suddenly felt unsteady. "Really? Really? You're going to be published. Congratulations." The news spread quickly, first through the mathematics department at State University, then to other universities as professors shared the interesting story about the high school student with the elegant proof. Then local news picked it up, a human interest story about the quiet teenager who'd solved an impossible problem, while his classmates were watching movies and hanging out at the mall. A reporter from the local newspaper came to interview David at school. She asked him questions about his background, his interests, what he wanted to do with his future. David, uncomfortable with all the attention, gave short, modest answers. "What made you think you could solve this problem?" the reporter asked. David thought about this. "I didn't think about whether I could or couldn't, I just thought it was interesting. I wanted to understand it. And what's next for you? More impossible problems?" He smiled slightly. "I just want to keep learning. Keep thinking about things that interest me." The article ran on the front page of the local section. "Local Teen Cracks Advanced Math Problem. Stuns University Professors." David's parents framed it and hung it in the restaurant. Customers would point at it and at David, who'd be clearing tables or taking orders, just doing his normal work. But the real validation came from an unexpected source. About a month after the verification process began, Dr. Fitzgerald forwarded David an email. It was from Professor Klaus Müller in Germany, the mathematician who'd published the original proof 2 years earlier. David read it with trembling hands. "Dear David, I have reviewed your proof with great interest. Your approach is remarkably elegant and intuitive. While my proof established the theorem, yours illuminates it. You have the mind of a true mathematician. I hope you will continue in this field. The mathematical community needs fresh perspectives like yours." David read the email 3 times, then showed it to his parents even though they didn't fully understand the significance. A professional mathematician, someone famous in his field, had called him a true mathematician, had said the community needed people like him. It was in that moment that David's future clicked into place. He'd been thinking vaguely about college, about maybe studying engineering or computer science, something practical that would lead to a stable career, but now he understood what he really wanted to do. He wanted to be a mathematician, not just someone who studied mathematics, but someone who contributed to it, who pushed its boundaries, who discovered new truths about the abstract world of numbers and logic. That evening, he sat in his room, the German professor's email still open on his laptop. Outside his window, the city was coming alive with evening activity. Below in the restaurant, his parents were serving customers, working hard as always. The story spread far beyond what anyone expected. What started as a local newspaper article caught the attention of a regional news station. They sent a camera crew to Lincoln High School, where they filmed David in Mr. Harrison's classroom, standing at the same board where he'd first presented his proof. The segment aired during the evening news, a feel-good story about the immigrant kid who'd stunned the mathematics world. From there, it snowballed. A national education website picked it up, then a mathematics blog that was popular among academics. Within 2 months of David's initial presentation, his story had been featured in education magazines, online forums, and even a short segment on a morning talk show that neither David nor his parents watched because they were too busy with the breakfast rush at the restaurant. But David himself tried to stay grounded. He still went to school every day, still helped at the restaurant every evening, still did his homework and studied for tests. The difference was that now opportunities kept appearing that he'd never imagined before. The first invitation came from the state mathematics competition. They wanted David to join the team representing Lincoln High School. He'd never done competitive mathematics before. The idea of solving problems under time pressure, competing against other students, made him nervous. But Mr. Harrison encouraged him. "It's different from what you've done," his teacher explained. "But it'll expose you to new types of problems, new ways of thinking. And honestly, David, I think you'll be good at it." So David joined the math team. The other members, most of whom had been competing since middle school, were initially skeptical. Who was this quiet kid who'd never shown up to a single practice before? But when they saw him work through problems, when they watched him find creative solutions that none of them had considered, their skepticism turned to respect. At the regional competition in March, Lincoln High School placed second overall. David scored perfectly in his division. The team captain, a senior girl named Olivia who'd been competing for 6 years, shook his hand afterward. "That last problem," she said. "The one about the infinite series? I've been staring at similar problems for years and never found an approach that clean. How'd you think of it?" David shrugged. "I just tried to visualize what was happening. Sometimes if you can see it, the algebra becomes obvious." Word spread through the mathematics competition circuit. Coaches from other schools asked about the kid from Lincoln High who'd come out of nowhere. At the state competition in April, university recruiters watched David work, making notes, discussing him in hushed voices. But the ripple effects weren't just about David. Something bigger was happening at Lincoln High School. Mr. Harrison, energized by David's achievement and feeling perhaps like he'd glimpsed what was possible when you really challenged students, started changing how he taught. He began including more open-ended problems in his classes. Not just exercises with known answers, but genuine puzzles that required creative thinking. He created a problem of the week board in his classroom. Every Monday he'd post a challenging problem. Students could work on it individually or in groups, and anyone who submitted a solution, whether correct or not, got extra credit just for trying. The problems ranged from difficult but accessible to genuinely advanced, things that would make most adults scratch their heads. At first, only a few students participated, but slowly more started paying attention. They'd gather around the board during lunch or after school, discussing approaches, arguing about methods, collaborating in ways Mr. Harrison had rarely seen before. One of those students was a sophomore named Tyler. He'd always thought he was bad at math. He struggled with algebra, barely passed geometry, was planning to take the easiest math classes possible his last 2 years so he could graduate. But something about the problem of the week intrigued him. Maybe it was because there was no pressure, no grade attached except positive reinforcement for trying. Tyler started attempting the problems. His first few solutions were completely wrong, but Mr. Harrison wrote encouraging comments anyway, pointing out the parts of his reasoning that were sound. Slowly, Tyler got better. He started understanding how to break complex problems into smaller pieces, how to test his ideas, how to verify his logic. By the end of the semester, Tyler had solved 3 problems of the week completely correctly. More importantly, he'd discovered that maybe he wasn't bad at math. Maybe he'd just never been challenged in the right way. "I think I want to take pre-calculus next year," Tyler told Mr. Harrison one day after class, "instead of the basic math course." Mr. Harrison smiled. "I think that's an excellent decision. You've shown you can handle challenging material when you're engaged with it." The change spread beyond Mr. Harrison's classroom. Dr. Okoye, inspired by David's achievement and seeing the renewed energy in the mathematics department, proposed starting a mathematics club. Not just for the competition team, but for anyone interested in exploring mathematics beyond the standard curriculum. The first meeting, held on a Thursday afternoon in October, expected maybe 10 students. 40 showed up. They crammed into Mr. Harrison's classroom, sitting on desks, standing against walls, all curious about this new opportunity. Dr. Okoye stood at the front, somewhat overwhelmed by the turnout. "Okay," she said with a smile. I see we're going to need a bigger room. But welcome, everyone. This club is for anyone who finds mathematics interesting, who wants to explore problems and ideas beyond what we cover in regular classes. They met every week. Sometimes they worked on competition problems. Sometimes they explored mathematical concepts just for fun. They had guest speakers, including Dr. Fitzgerald from the university, who came to talk about her research. They watched documentaries about famous mathematicians. They argued about different approaches to problems, collaborated on difficult questions, and created a community around their shared interest. David attended when he could, though his schedule was increasingly busy. He'd become something of a mentor figure, even though he didn't think of himself that way. Younger students would ask him for help with problems, and he'd patiently work through them, showing his approach, encouraging them to think creatively. One day, a freshman girl named Amy approached him nervously. "David, can I ask you something?" "Sure." "How did you know you were good enough to solve that problem? Like, how did you have the confidence to even try?" David thought about this carefully. "I didn't know. I wasn't confident at all, actually. I just found it interesting, so I kept working on it. I think sometimes we stop ourselves before we even start because we assume we can't do something, but you don't know what you can do until you try." Amy nodded, processing this. She'd been struggling in her geometry class, convinced she wasn't smart enough for advanced mathematics. But watching David, seeing that he was just a regular person who'd worked hard and refused to give up, made her think maybe she could do more than she believed. The changes weren't limited to students either. Other teachers started noticing what was happening in the mathematics department. The energy, the engagement, the genuine excitement about learning. Some of them began adapting similar approaches in their own subjects. The history teacher started posting primary source documents and asking students to analyze them like historians rather than just memorizing dates. The English teacher introduced creative writing challenges that encouraged experimentation and risk-taking. The science department organized a showcase where students could present original research projects. Lincoln High School, which had always been a decent but unremarkable public school, started developing a reputation as a place where students were pushed to think deeply, to explore beyond the textbook, to surprise themselves with what they could accomplish. The local newspaper ran a follow-up story a year after David's initial achievement. How one student's mathematical breakthrough transformed a school. They interviewed students, teachers, and administrators, documenting the changes that had rippled outward from that one Tuesday morning when a quiet kid had walked up to a whiteboard. David read the article at the restaurant during a slow afternoon. It felt strange seeing himself described as someone who'd transformed something. He'd just solved a problem that interested him. Everything else had happened around him because of choices other people had made. But maybe that was how change worked, he thought. Someone does something unexpected and it shows other people what's possible. It creates permission for others to try things they wouldn't have tried before, to push boundaries they'd assumed were fixed. The mathematics club grew to over 60 regular members by David's senior year. The competition team expanded from 8 students to 25. 3 other students from Lincoln High School went on to win significant mathematics awards. Tyler, the kid who'd thought he was bad at math, ended up accepting a scholarship to study engineering at State University. And Mr. Harrison? He was rediscovering why he'd become a teacher in the first place, not just to convey information, but to inspire curiosity, to challenge students, to help them discover capabilities they didn't know they had. One afternoon, almost 2 years after David's initial breakthrough, Mr. Harrison stood in his classroom after school looking at the problem of the week board.